So I'm going to, I guess, approach this a little bit differently. Um, I'm going to look at it from a traditional knowledge and Indigenous legal orders perspective, and hopefully I'll be able to sort of have some sort of logic to apply to this over the next 5 minutes. So I always want to start by stating that Indigenous peoples in these territories have been here for thousands of years. And with that, had their own knowledge systems, their own legal systems, own governance systems, education systems, everything, just like any other complete society would have. And as a previous panelist said earlier, there was incredible disruption to these systems through colonization and imposition of other people's laws on Indigenous peoples. But even with that kind of history, these laws and traditions still exist. So what I wanted to focus on in this very short, in my short remarks, is on water and understanding Indigenous people's relationship to water, particularly as we see in Canada with water crisis and another more recent one with boil water advisories and Indigenous communities and another evacuation of a First Nation community who's not basically receiving basic rights. So what does water have to do with religion, or as I would prefer to talk about it as more as spirituality? Is water is understood to be life. So water is understood to having its own agency. Water is understood to have its own personality in Indigenous worldview and ontology. And water is understood to be a life-giving force in, as far as I can tell, most Indigenous societies. And I'm Anishinaabe myself, so I know my own tradition a lot more than I understand others. So, but this is juxtapositioned with the fact that the planet, along with ecological and climate crisis, is also a water crisis. So this is recognized in the World Water Reports put out every year in March. And even within these international forums, Indigenous peoples have a hard time having their voices and perspectives heard. One of the areas that I do like to kind of pay attention to that exemplify Indigenous people's perspectives on water are Indigenous water declarations. And in almost all of these declarations, the Indigenous people's Coyote Water declarations and others, is that water is understood to be a source of material, cultural, and spiritual life. Water is honored and respected as sacred and sustaining all life. The Gamma Indigenous Water Declaration also speaks to responsibilities and obligations in relation to water in accordance with our own Indigenous legal traditions, protocols, treaties, and processes. Water is not understood to be a commodity. It's considered to be a spirit, which has a right to be treated as an ecological entity with its own right to exist outside of serving humans. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has also articulated similar sentiments in Article 25, where they talk about Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationships with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied lands and waters. The UN Declaration, what it also essentially does is it provides for the protection of the special relationship with water, the spiritual relationship with water, recognizes Indigenous legal traditions as sources of law. For example, the obligation to protect waters for future generations, the inherent right of Indigenous peoples to govern as self-determined people in accordance with our own legal traditions. It also enables the assertion of our own jurisdiction. And that our relationship with water has a spiritual base. So how this relates explicitly to human rights. So surprisingly, the United Nations recognized the human right to water in 2010 in a resolution. And the idea was to ensure that humans had access to water and sanitation, that it was safe and affordable for all people without discrimination. The Human Rights Council in 2011 adopted something similar, safe drinking water and sanitation as a human right, a right to life and to human dignity. These are extremely important resolutions, because the fact is a lot of Indigenous peoples and other people around the world do not have access to clean water. But what one of the things I think I wanted to point out is the importance of recognition of the human rights, but how that contrasts a bit with Indigenous people's understanding of their relationship to water, and how our legal traditions play a role in how we understand what this relationship is. So from an Indigenous legal order or ontological perspective, the human right to water, although important, doesn't cover everything that's important to Indigenous peoples. Water is still understood as being a commodity, property, a resource, and we have a human right to water. So there's a binary in terms of human and water. Whereas in Indigenous ontology, we're understood to also be water itself, because we're mostly made up of water, and we construct the idea of water differently. So the human right to water doesn't go far enough in terms of recognizing how Indigenous peoples understand their relationship to water. And I'll just end with this. So this kind of thinking and understanding is starting to take a little bit of hold in some ways. So for example, the understanding of the rights to water, rights as having personhood and having rights to water. So we saw this in New Zealand with the Waitangi River, the Rights of Mother Earth Constitution in Bolivia, the Rights of Mother Earth Declaration that came out in 2010, recognizing the rights of water and the earth itself. I think I'll probably end there. What I did want to end with, though, is colonial impositions or nation state imposition of their laws on Indigenous legal orders continues to be a problem in the expression of Indigenous spirituality in relation to the natural world, and in particular to waters, which we see across Canada in relation to boil water advisories that Indigenous peoples, particularly First Nations, continue to experience. So that's still a lived reality. And I think I will end there, and thank you.